Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Riley, and I have the privilege of bringing our message tonight. When Noah asked me if I could preach this week, it was a couple of months ago, he said that there's no assigned passage or topic for you to preach on. You can do whatever you like. And I went, that's a dangerous proposition to give to me. But I'm preaching tonight on perseverance. And I'm preaching on that because in the last sort of couple of months, particularly in our LifeCom, but I suspect it's not limited to our LifeCom, a number of our group have been struggling with various things and just coming to a point of just saying, look, I've had enough. And I'm guessing that's not limited to my LifeCom. I think that's probably a broader thing. I'm also conscious, we're basically the midpoint of the year. We're halfway through our year of the way of Jesus. He doesn't feature in my message, but he wasn't born yet. But I'm conscious it's the middle of the year. We've got another 6 months to go before the end of the year. It's cold, it's dreary, and perseverance is not necessarily the easiest thing. So bear with me. Parts of this message I actually preached a few years ago at my home church in Adelaide as a part of a series we did on possibly the most famous, or one of the most famous passages in the Bible, the classic wedding Bible verse, 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. Does anyone know it by heart? No. Love is kind, love is patient, love is 17 other things. The last of which is love is persevering. Which grammatically doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but never mind. Some of you would know the book of 1 Corinthians is a letter written by Paul to the church in the city of Corinth. And Paul writes that letter because he's concerned that they are straying from God's path, and he's trying to help guide them to sort of right the ship. And personally, I can't help but notice that Paul uses 15 adjectives in that passage to describe what love is, but he leaves persevering until last. It's almost to me as if Paul is saying, if you remember one thing, I want you to remember that God's love is persevering. Throughout the Bible, there are plenty of people that I could talk to about perseverance, people that have struggled and overcome challenges, but in my opinion, none of those more fits the bill than Joseph. So rather than sort of be a little bit hypothetical, I want to walk us through the story of Joseph and what it can teach us about perseverance. Because time and time again, it looks as though Joseph is, the sky's the limit for him, only for the rug to be pulled out and it gets slammed to the ground again and again. You're probably familiar with Joseph's story already. If you're not, there's a Disney movie I recommend. Don't worry, I won't sing any of the songs. But if you're not familiar with it and you don't want to check out the movie, you can find it in Genesis chapters 37 to 50. I'm not going to read it because I don't have enough voice for that, but I will summarize it. So Joseph is born as the 10th son of Jacob. And basically from the moment he's born, he is loved more than any of his other siblings by his father, which is great for Joseph, but he leaves his siblings understandably quite jealous. Joseph's siblings are deeply jealous and to the point of actually hating him because of how much their father loves him more than he loves them. But also Joseph is given opportunities that his brothers aren't. They're sent out into the fields to do manual labour. Joseph is kept at home to learn how to read and write. And it becomes apparent quite soon that God has plans for Joseph that he doesn't have for Joseph's brothers. Joseph is gifted with the ability of interpreting dreams. And the text doesn't expressly say this, but I think young Joseph does not necessarily handle his being special all that well. and he rubs it in the noses of his brothers in a way that they do not appreciate. We've all done stupid things when we were young. Some of us are still doing them when we're old. But for example, so Joseph has these dreams which basically prophesy that he will rule over his brothers and be their leader, which they don't love, particularly because, first of all, he's the youngest. Second of all, he doesn't really do anything for the family. He doesn't work the fields. He doesn't look after the sheep. So why on earth should he be in charge of them? They don't obviously see what God's plan is. And Joseph just takes it as gospel that, yeah, one day I'll be in charge of all of you. Well, as I said, they don't take all that well to it. But life's pretty good for Joseph at this point. He's riding high, cruisy life, comfortable. His brothers, however, decide to take matters into their own hands, and they plan to kill Joseph. They decide not to, and instead they sell him into slavery. Just imagine that for a minute. I mean, I don't know, I imagine most people here have at least one sibling or a cousin or a close friend, but imagine if that person sold you into slavery. Someone you looked up to, someone you trusted. Joseph goes from cloud 9 to being a slave. And Joseph, bear in mind, has never really worked a day in his life. He's never worked the fields. He's been kept at home, sheltered and protected. Joseph is taken to Egypt and he's sold as an object. And he's sold to a guy called Potiphar. Potiphar's actually not a terrible person, apart from the fact that he owns slaves, but we'll push past that under the cultural norms of the time. But Potiphar realizes quite quickly that Joseph is not like most slaves. Joseph is smart, he's intelligent, he speaks multiple languages, he can read and write. And very quickly Joseph begins to rise up in Potiphar's house and is quickly basically put in charge of all other slaves and is treated more like an employee than a slave. As far as being a slave goes, Joseph is in about the best position you can be. Once again, Joseph has got to a comfortable point in life, maybe not as comfortable as he was at home with his dad and his brothers, but he's not being treated like you would expect a slave of that time to be treated. God has protected and brought him through that. Unfortunately for Joseph, Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him a little bit too much. And she tries very hard to seduce him. And Joseph refuses and declines. She doesn't take well to that. And she makes some false accusations about him to Potiphar. And Potiphar is forced to choose between the word of his wife and the word of a slave. And so Joseph is thrown into jail without ever being given the opportunity to defend himself or say anything in his own defense. Once again, Joseph is riding high, and all of a sudden the rug is pulled out from underneath him and he crashes to the bottom. He's thrown into prison, no trial, no course of justice, nothing. I can't imagine what's going through Joseph's mind at this point. It's been a rocky couple of years. But he's in prison, and once again, the gifts that God has given him start to become useful. Joseph interacts with a couple of the prisoners that he's with and interprets their dreams for them. And one of those prisoners is then, a few days later, as predicted by, or prophesied by Joseph, is taken before the Pharaoh to be his cupbearer. And Joseph begs that prisoner as he's leaving to remember his gift and to tell Pharaoh about his gift. Unfortunately, faced with in the joy and jubilance of being released from prison, that man completely forgets about Joseph. And Joseph remains in prison for, it's not entirely clear. We think that it's somewhere between 3 and 12 years. So that's quite a broad window, but the amount of time is not really relevant. Joseph is just stuck there, doing nothing in prison for a crime he never actually committed. And he's just stuck. Once again, I can't imagine what's going through Joseph's mind at that point. To have had a glimpse of maybe getting out of prison through this other prisoner, only to then be abandoned and almost forgotten, essentially. But a few years later, Pharaoh is troubled by a series of dreams that none of his priests or wise people can interpret for him. And only then does this former prisoner remember Joseph and his gift. Pharaoh has Joseph brought before him, and Joseph is able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. And in doing so is able to save Egypt from several years of famine, because that's what God had planned for Joseph to be able to do. Joseph's story goes on quite a bit further than that, but from that point forward, Joseph is essentially the second most powerful person in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh. Finally, Joseph's story comes to fruition in the sense that no longer is he brought right to the brink or right to the top and then slammed to the ground. His perseverance has finally paid off. Some predictions say that from the time he's sold into slavery to the time he meets Pharaoh is somewhere between 15 years. 15 years is a long time to wait when you don't know what God's plan is. 15 years is a long time to wait when you're a slave and a prisoner. But through all of that time, Joseph never loses his faith. He never loses hope. And he never forgets the dreams that he had as a child that predicted that one day he would be a ruler of men. Never once does he take his eye off that. Personally, I reckon I probably would have thrown in the towel at the first stage when I was sold into slavery. Certainly when I was thrown into jail for something I didn't do. I don't know about you, but that would be very difficult for me to deal with. I would have just said, look, I had enough. Like, I tried fighting the good fight, and what have I got to show for it? This is rubbish. You might be wondering, why on earth am I telling you this? Because, well, I won't make any assumptions, but I'm guessing no one in this room is God's anointed dream interpreter. No takers? It's fair. I'll get to it in a minute, but I want to draw, in Genesis chapter 39, verse 21, I want to draw out, it doesn't tell us a whole lot about Joseph's time in prison, but it does tell us in that verse, in verse 21, God's love was with him every day. Every day God's love was the thing that Joseph turned to for strength, for comfort, and for hope. God's love was the only thing that kept Joseph from losing his hope of getting freedom. Through God's love, Joseph was able to persevere. Now, I'll come back to my point of why am I sharing this with you. It's because the story of Joseph is not a story about a man with a gift. It's a story about a man with two gifts. The first one is obvious. He has the gift of interpreting dreams. But it's not his gift of interpreting dreams that drags him to his feet every time he gets knocked down. It's not his gift of interpreting dreams that pushes him to persevere no matter what happens. It's the second gift, which is God's love. And that's relevant because everybody in this room, just like Joseph, has God's love. I want to illustrate that point by telling you another story. It took me a long time to find all the details of this story, but it takes place during the time of the Berlin Wall. Now, I'm guessing based on the age of the general group in the room, some of you may not know what the Berlin Wall actually is. Anyone brave enough to admit that? Yeah, one person. Others too afraid. So the Berlin Wall is a very interesting part of history. Don't worry, it's not a history lecture. But essentially, post-World War II, Germany is split into, well, it started as four, but by the time the 60s roll around, it's basically West and East Germany. East Germany, communist. West Germany, not communist. But interestingly, they didn't just split the country in half, they split the capital city of Berlin in half as well. So you can see a tiny little speck of blue in the middle of all that red is actually part of West Germany, which is interesting because communist country, you can't really leave without permission, except that you could, if you were in Berlin, simply cross to the other side of the city and then you could leave. You could hop on a plane and get to the main part of West Germany and then you could go wherever you want. I promise it's not a history or a geography lecture. But pretty soon after they did that, East Germany started realising that a lot of people didn't want to live in a communist country and were leaving, which was crippling their economy. All of their skilled labourers, all of their doctors, all their lawyers, etc., were leaving. So overnight, well, almost overnight, they built a wall around that tiny speck of blue in East Berlin so that you could no longer cross from one side to the other, which is a bit like, imagine your neighbour built a wall all the way around your house. It's not on your property, so you can't do anything about it, but you also can't leave. Like you can't get around their wall. It's a weird thing. Anyway, that wall was in place for a little while, and then pretty much overnight, they closed it so you couldn't cross from one side to the other. You can get rid of the image now. Which leads me to the story I want to tell, which takes place in 1961 when the wall closed. All of a sudden you couldn't go from one side to the other. But the day before that was to occur, a woman called Sigrid was living in East Germany, and she was heavily pregnant. She went into labour, and due to complications from her labour, she had to have a caesarean. And her son was not doing so well, but the hospital in East Germany was not really equipped for newborns. So he was put in an ambulance and taken to the nearest hospital that was. Ordinarily, that would have been fine, but the nearest hospital that was in West Berlin. And that night, the border between the two closed. So they were in different countries and they couldn't cross. Due to complications from the caesarean, Sigrid was in a coma for several weeks. It was about 4 weeks before she was actually able to leave the hospital. And at that point, she realised that her son was in a foreign country and she couldn't actually leave to go and visit him. But even more tragically, the hospital in West Berlin, due to the way the transfer was handled, hadn't had any parents listed for this little boy, and he'd been assumed to have been an orphan, so he'd been adopted out. So he was in a foreign country, she couldn't leave to go and visit him, but also he was now somebody else's child. And Sigrid described this in her journal as the worst moment in her entire life. She said it was as if all the colour from the world had drained. And she was faced with a pretty difficult consideration. She didn't want her son to have to grow up in a communist country, but if she identified that she was his mother, he would be dragged back to East Berlin as an East Berlin citizen or East German citizen. So she decided not to declare or not to claim to be his parent, but instead to try and seek permission to move to West Berlin through legitimate means by getting a visa, which was difficult but not impossible at the time. But it was pretty tough for her, and she wrote in her journal that the only thing she could do was to sit and to pray. So every morning she got up and she would pray, and then she would write a letter to the immigration whatevers, requesting permission, requesting a permit to move or to visit West Berlin, and she never got a response. For 4 years she did that every single day. She wrote an application every single day. Finally one day she received a response telling her to come to the immigration office, and she thought, this is it, I'm finally going to get my permit to go and visit and meet my son, who is now, by the way, 4 years old, doesn't know his mother, doesn't know he has a mother in East Berlin. She's overwhelmed. She goes to the immigration office thinking that this is going to be the time that she gets her papers. and she's arrested by the Stasi, which is the secret police. And she's placed under house arrest as a dissident. Essentially, they viewed her as a troublemaker who had to be silenced because it was damaging to the communist regime to have people wanting to leave. So she had to be silenced. Sigrid had been just hours, well, had thought she was just hours away from getting a ticket to meet her 4-year-old son, only to then be arrested and locked in her house. But she refused to give up. She refused whatsoever to be broken by this. And so for 6 years, she spent in house arrest every day. She prayed for an end. She prayed for an end to the house arrest. She prayed an end to her suffering. And she prayed over her son that he would continue to have the life that she wanted him to have in the West. She drew strength from the only place she could, which was from God's love. That was the one thing she wrote that she had left. 6 years she was in house arrest before it was finally lifted. And Sigrid thought that if they had lifted her house arrest, presumably they had assumed she was no longer a threat. So she immediately went back to petitioning for a pass to visit West Germany. Probably not the smartest thing to do, although a reasonable assumption, I would say. But the Stasi didn't see it that way. She was immediately rearrested, but this time she wasn't given house arrest. She was thrown in jail without a trial, without a court date, without an opportunity to defend herself. Sigrid wrote in her journal, the time she spent in prison, the guards spent every day trying to make her miserable by worsening her conditions. They would withhold food for days in a row. They would take away blankets in the middle of the German winter, and they would beat her consistently and regularly, claiming that if she wanted to leave, she should just die. Every day she woke up and said, "I cannot do this anymore, God, why have you done this to me?" Every day she prayed for strength to keep going. And she wrote in her journal that when she prayed every day, God responded with just 3 words. He just said, "I love you." That was all she got. Not, "Don't worry, I've got a plan." Not, "Trust me, I haven't forgotten you." Just, "I love you." But for Sigrid, that was all she needed. She knew that as long as God's love was with her, nothing that the guards would do, nothing that the Stasi could do, nothing that the communist regime could do could break her. All she had to do was wait and endure and persevere. Fast forward, she was eventually released from prison, but still not able to visit the West, still not able to contact or to visit her son. Finally, 1989 arrives. Her son is now 28 years old, and the Berlin Wall finally falls. Finally, she is able to go freely to the West. She tracked down her son and finally embraced him for the first time and explained who she was. Finally, her perseverance had paid off. 6 days later, Sigrid passed away. On the final page of her journal, her son wrote that she died with a smile on her face and God's love in her heart. I can't imagine what those 28 years were like for Sigrid. I'm not a parent, but I'm mindful there are a few parents here. Yes. I can't imagine what that's like. Words such as awful or terrible, horrible, I don't think they come close. And you might be thinking that's an awful story about a woman suffering that's completely pointless and irrelevant. That's a fair observation, but there's one more part to the story that I haven't shared yet. And it's that after hearing Sigrid's story and her fight to be in her son's life, the day after Sigrid passed away, her son and his wife committed their lives to Jesus and raised their children as Christians. Sigrid's suffering was not in vain. It certainly wasn't pointless. It doesn't lessen her suffering, but her perseverance was not for nothing. And her perseverance came from one place, and that was the love that she held in her heart for God. Didn't matter how dark her situation got no matter how awful the conditions, no matter how long the tunnel looked, or how long the journey looked before freedom might arrive. She never lost the love of God's. That she never lost God's love in her heart. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that with God's love everything will be smooth and rainbows. What it does say is that God's love is persevering and God's love is eternal. In other words, it doesn't matter what obstacle is before us. Joseph and Sigrid have proved that if we utilise God's love that's in our heart, nothing can break us, nothing can prevent us from getting where God wants us to go. I don't know what it is that you might be struggling with at the moment, whether it's something with work, whether it's something with your family. Could be 14 other different things. But most of us, I think, would be struggling with at least something. Maybe it's a relationship that's broken down that you just haven't been able to bring yourself to try and mend, because opening those old wounds is harder than just living with the relationship as it is now. Maybe it's something financial. Maybe it's that you're putting up with a job you hate simply because it's easier than trying to find a new job. Or it's easier than stepping out in faith and trusting that God will provide. I don't know, as I said, I don't know what it is that you might be struggling with. But I want to encourage you to remember that you, just like Sigrid and just like Joseph, have God's love that you can call upon. So whatever it is that you are struggling with, I want to encourage you, first of all, to persevere. And secondly, to listen to what God is calling you to do with that situation. I am confident, dare I say positive, that God is not calling you to run and hide. God calls us to persevere, and sometimes that means fighting back. Sometimes that means finding another way. I don't know what that is for you, but I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. But running and hiding is almost never the answer. So if there's something you're struggling with, I don't think that's the solution. So I want to encourage you to think about what it is that God has called upon your heart to do with whatever it is that you're struggling with. I want to encourage you to call upon God's strength and God's love to deal with whatever it is that is ailing you or that you are struggling with. I would be more than happy to talk to anyone here about whatever it is that they might be struggling with, whatever it is that you might be trying to persevere with. I encourage you that, you don't have to talk to me, but I encourage you to talk to someone about it. Persevering on your own is possible, but it's a lot harder, and it's not necessary. None of us is like Sigrid being locked in a secret police prison, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. But no one here has been forgotten. So we don't have to persevere on our own. I encourage you to talk to someone, and I encourage you to do that today. Find the person you need to talk to and have that conversation rather than putting it off and saying, I'll get to it later in the week, because we never do. It becomes just another thing that's, and we never actually do it. So I want to encourage you to have that conversation with whoever it is that you want to have it with. But on that note, I'm going to close my message in prayer. I just encourage you to think about whatever it is that you're struggling with and whatever it is that you need help persevering with. I encourage you to call upon God's strength in doing that. So would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I just thank you that you are all-powerful and that you are mighty, but that you love beyond all of those things. Lord, you have the power to crumble cities, to stop time. You have unending power, but the thing that you utilize the most is love. Lord, I just thank you that you have gifted each and every one of us with that love and the power that comes with your love. I just ask that as we persevere with whatever it is that we might be struggling with, that you would remind us that we are not alone in that fight. I just ask that you remind us that you are there with us every single step of the way, that we can call upon you no matter what it is, no matter how major or insignificant it might seem, we can call upon you for support. I just pray that you continue to remind us, but that you continue to push us to remind others of that also, Lord. That we wouldn't sit and just wait for our friends or our loved ones to come to us and ask for help, that we would reach out to them and just offer support wherever it is that we can, Lord. Just pray these and all things in your name. Amen.